Okay. Good morning, everybody. Everyone feeling good? We have a really amazing day for you today. I'm very excited to see everyone. Following on from Rizvana's lead yesterday, we're going to try to include some conversational interludes between the various presentations, and we really hope that people in the audience will feel inspired to be involved, to get involved, and using the terminology that we used yesterday, to study, to be together in the room, to hold the space, and to think together about the issues that our illustrious speakers are going to raise for us. We're going to build on, I hope, some of the conversations yesterday that were so intense and so useful. There was, for example, an extended debate, conversation about intimacy that stretched from Lynette's paintings at the very beginning of the day to all the way through to Hortense Spiller's concluding remarks. There was also a demonstration of choreographies of falling and failing, touching and breaking that linked Legier's work to Erin's and to Wu's. And there was a number of meditations on migration, liquid geographies, loss and violence that emerged through Araceli's poems and the films that we watched from Ayal. And then throughout, Rizvana, her improvised remarks around race, the black body, dance, and touch sort of held us in place. So I really want to pull that energy into today because it was a remarkable day, and I thank everybody who was involved. So what we're going to do today is sort of bring to the table and add to the conversation what I hope will be a number of different theories of desire and the erotic. And obviously any conference focused on touch and the haptic at some point has to offer an account of the erotic. And I'm thinking that we're not going to necessarily separate the erotic out from violence, but we're going to find that violence is already in place within the erotic, and that touching holds within it all kinds of different textures of violence with which we're going to have to reckon. So we're going to talk today about making and unmaking. And it's that the force of unmaking is something that I hope that we can reckon with. When we think about making, we're going to turn away from sort of high cultural forms of making towards low cultural DIY modes of making. And both Julia Bryan-Wilson and Jean Vaccaro look at the politics of the handmade and think about the location that Wilson has named for us as the fray. And in this beautiful book on textile art, she offers this theory of the fray, which is both the frayed edge, but also being in the fray, in the thick of things. So it's both an edge and a centerpiece, and a making, and also the place where what we've made begins to fall apart. And so it's that edge that I hope we can find today and uncomfortably occupy. So why unmaking? Well, desire in its most interesting forms is anarchic. The compact forms of desire, the predictable forms of desire, sort of undo the logic of desire. Desire in its pure form is anarchic. So along the way, we're also going to conjure certain kinds of bodies. So we have this framework of sexuality, desire, the erotic, but I'm also hoping to put in play a number of different forms of embodiment. And two forms that we could usefully think with are the transasterix body, by which I do not mean a transgender identity, I mean transvariance, the variation across bodies of the thing that we call gender. And then the other body that we'll focus on through Mao Chen's work, for example, is the body of varying abilities. Sometimes we say the disabled body, but again, in keeping with this logic of variation across the body politic, we might want to think about not a disabled body, but able variant bodies with different relations to ability. Trans embodiment for a long time has been classified as wrong, the wrong body. But wrongness comes up in a number of different sites to describe other coordinates, including racialized bodies and class bodies. Just to give you an example of perhaps the most powerful statement in the 20th century of wrongness, we could go to June Jordan's poem About My Rights, which turns a turgid and blocked discourse on rights and the access to rights into a meditation on wrongness, discomfort, a wrongness that is about being in a body, but is also specifically about being in a racialized body. She says, because I have been wrong, the wrong sex, the wrong age. And at one point she said, I am the very meaning of wrong, which she relates to an experience of rape. But she also counters this accusation of wrongness with, I am not wrong, wrong is not my name. So we're going to think about wrong-bodiedness in relationship to these various coordinates of race, class, gender, desire, and ability. The wrong body is an appellation used mostly for people who have felt themselves to be out of time, out of place. And we're not using it here in order to claim right. Okay, I want to really make that clear. We don't want to restore wrong bodies to a relationship to rightness. We want to use them to dismantle the system that depends upon their wrongness. Okay, those are two very, very different projects. One project comes to claim rightness. Another project comes to dismantle the project that has claimed them as wrong in the first place. That is our haptic project. These trans bodies and bodies of varying abilities will be most spectacularly on display in the work of Mel Chen today and Paul Preciado, who's going to speak about a transgender Chilean artist who, after a terrible accident, lost their arms and therefore learned how to paint anew. That's Lorenzo Bertner will be the subject of Paul Preciado's presentation. Like Jean Vaccaro's work on the trans-asterix body, both Preciado and Chen seek ways around diagnostic modes of seeing and knowing the trans body, right? So the trans body has come to be known through the diagnostic. What's wrong with that body? How can that body be fixed? Jean, in her work, asks repeatedly whether there are other ways of approaching trans embodiment that do not seek to understand that body via medical forms of the gaze. And that has come to the surface in Mel Chen's work, in that Mel has given us an incredible vocabulary for thinking about this agitated, animated space of disability. So trans-asterix bodies function not simply as bodies that provide an image of the non-normative against which normative bodies can be discerned, but as bodies, all of our bodies, that are fragmentary, internally contradictory, bodies that remap gender and its relations to race, place, class, and sexualities, bodies that are in pain or that represent a play of surfaces, bodies that sound different from the way they look, bodies that represent palimpsestic relationships to identity. Now, the problem is we can talk about those bodies and we can conjure them, but how to represent them? The modes of representation that we have in, let's say, Western art, just to be super general, are not up to the task of representing these other bodies, these wrong bodies. And that's why we're turning to the haptic. So if we need a logic for today, is that we want a different code, to use Hortense Spiller's terms, a different grammar that breaks from what she calls an American grammar of embodiment, and all that includes, deeply racialized understandings of the body. We break from that grammar and we seek another vocabulary and another grammar to hold the body out of place and out of time. And this is where we might want to turn away from art, even for a moment, and go towards science. And this is, of course, where Karen Barad's enormously influential work comes into play. One of the things that happens in arts and humanities is that we are so untutored, if you like, in developments in science, that we often are making reference to expired understandings of scientific systems. We're Newtonian when things have become Einsteinian, right? So one of the things that Karen Barad does is offer to us a completely different registering of the world through quantum physics, for example, something that is just out of our grasp or reach for many of us, but becomes at least imaginable in the productive conjurings that Barad's work offers. And one of the things that happens when we begin to approach the body through the conditions that Barad offers is that the human also begins to come apart. The human that was tethered to a Newtonian understanding of the world is not the human that emerges out of, say, quantum field theory. These are completely different understandings of the body and time, okay? So if we use different scientific frameworks, we can access different understandings of the human. So finally, before I introduce Julia Bryan-Wilson, I want to offer 3 frameworks for today, very, very briefly, that emerge from some of my work and that I hope will begin to offer a framework for the different presentations that we'll hear today, and I'll do this quickly. The first is obviously the haptic, which I've already talked about a little bit. Why the haptic? The haptic, I think, is an attempt to make an end run around the visual and all that the visual presupposes about a kind of imperial gaze, a domineering, masterful gaze. The haptic, based upon a sense of touch, suggests that there are other ways to know. And there are other ways to explore. There are other ways of feeling your way through the world. What does the haptic offer? Chance over causality, touch over vision, feeling over knowing, the flooding of the self rather than its emptying out, or the emptying out rather than its flooding, ecstatic unknowing over satisfied knowing, agitation and vibration. Okay, so we just think about those models of self that are very different from a Western art understanding of a body, a coherent body that sometimes comes apart, but only in very particular ways, and that even when it fragments, think Impressionism, you can still put those pieces back together again. We seek to fragment and hold without recreating, okay? We want things to fall apart. On behalf of that idea, the second frame is the anarchitectural. And this has valences with Erin Manning's work on the An-Archive. And the An-Architectural comes out of a 1970s art movement called An-Architecture that mostly was figured by Gordon Matta-Clark, a Chilean, New York-based artist who basically, and this exemplifies some of the principles of Karen Barad's work on the vacuum, he basically took abandoned buildings and in a way intensified their sense of abandonment. So he took a building that had been abandoned and he carved forms of more emptiness into it, right? He took a building, a house that had been completely neglected and split it. He took one of the piers, the Chelsea piers, and he carved forms into it. He took an abandoned 17th century building near the Pompidou Center and created a spiral through the middle of it. It's those forms of unmaking that we might recognize and register as the an-architectural, an infusion of anarchy into the built environment that insists that we find space within space, that we find differential modes of emptiness within the empty. This is what Karen Barad refers to in one of her pieces as, quote, nothingness as the scene of wild activities. Nothingness as the scene of wild activities, a perfect summary of the anarchitectural. Finally, I offer a frame, unless that seemed like too urban of a focus, I offer the frame of bewilderment. And I hope that we're all bewildered today. New materialists have been really preoccupied with the idea of enchantment, which is seems much more appealing and seductive than bewilderment. But I actually think that getting lost is part of what we're after here. We're not going to be experts who seek to find and to know. We hopefully will intensify the confusion that we put into circulation. Bewilderment which has its roots in relationship to the wild, originally meant being lost in pathless places, to confound for want of a plain road. And it was a term that was very, very much in use 300 to 400 years ago when people regularly got lost. No GPS. I think 10 years ago, no GPS, right? Remember when you were a tourist in Amsterdam with massive maps that you had to wrestle with on the corner somewhere? Now we GPS everything, which means we don't get lost. And this is maybe a problem. Bewilderment has been taken up by many thinkers and poets to access, that's telling me to stop, which I will, other forms of knowledge. And I think this is partly what Barad means by quantum method, what Chen means by agitation, what Vaccaro means by distraction, what Wilson means by fraying. I think everyone who's going to speak today will speak in and through bewilderment. Fanny Howe describes bewilderment as an explosion of parts, the quotidian smeared. And I love that sense of being just slightly on the edge of the ordinary, to the point where the ordinary becomes unrecognizable. But we also must recognize, in the spirit of yesterday's material discussions, that while the woods seem like a beautiful romantic place of bewilderment, they're also scary places of racial terror. The woods don't signify the same way for every subject who wanders within them. Fred Moten in Field Trio describes multiple scenes of racial terror and counters them with images of fugitivity. He writes, "I ran from it and was still in it." This construction whereby escape cannot deliver any subject, especially the racialized subject, to freedom, "I was still in it," does not imply the totality of capture, however. Running is important in Moten's poetic universe, arrival less so. What he really fears in the woods is not being lost, but being found, right? If you think about it. So this is why being found and finding is not our goal today. Like Moten and Howe, today's speakers will encourage bewilderment. They will guide us into oblivion, and they will hold us in the warm embrace of unknowing. They will reach out, and they will touch. I promise you that. I'm going to introduce everybody with a very short formal bio, and then I'll do a little improvised bio just to say personally how excited I am to have every single speaker with us here today. So what you need to know about Julia Bryan Wilson would take up another 15 minutes. So just so you know, she is Director of the Arts Research Center and Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at UC Berkeley. She's the author of many books. Most recently, she's curated an exhibit on Cecilia Vicuña called About to Happen, which will open at the Berkeley Art Museum in the summer. And her most recent book, Fray, Art and Textile Politics, was named a Best Art Book of the Year by the New York Times. Unofficially, Julia is the most prolific, imaginative, and creative art historian of her generation. Her new book, Fray, puts crafts and textile art at the very center of a new anti-market understanding of art and aesthetics, and shows how such work literally touches and holds practices and crafts, anti-imperial, anti-racist, and gender non-conforming forms of imagining life otherwise. So when we keep saying we want to make another world, her work is engaged with the artists who literally make other worlds. I couldn't think of a better thinker, a speaker, to begin our conversation today. I'm delighted that she's here. Julia Bryan Wilson, Material Relations.